So if there's one thing that basically everyone in this world can agree upon, it's that Walter White, aka Heisenberg, is one of the greatest characters of all time. Born from Vince Gilligan's infamous pitch of turning Mr. Chips into Scarface, Walter's descent from a seemingly mild-mannered chemistry teacher to a monstrous drug lord capable of truly abhorrent acts was only elevated by Breaking Bad's masterful writing and, of course, Bryan Cranston's once-in-a-generation performance. One of the things that really struck me when I first watched Breaking Bad, and this is true with Better Call Saul as well, is how it portrays morality, specifically the morality of its main characters. See, neither of these shows have any real interest in holding your hand and telling you how to feel. The story simply unfolds. It's pretty open to interpretation, at least in my eyes, and in the eyes of Vince Gilligan, who has stated multiple times that Breaking Bad belongs to the fans just as much as the writers, and that there is no single correct reading of the show. And this style of storytelling can make for an overall very uncomfortable viewing experience, actually. In fact, I would argue that it is this blurry, sludgy, grey, uncomfortable morality which is the main ingredient that makes both of these shows so incredible, so compelling, but also at times deeply divisive. Which leads us, of course, to the internet, specifically websites such as YouTube and Reddit, which, as everyone knows, are cornerstones of nuanced, civil, and level-headed discourse. Seriously though, I actually want to take a moment to appreciate just how incredible the online Breaking Bad community is. The fact that people are still debating and dissecting this show over a decade after it ended is a testament not just to how amazing Breaking Bad is as a piece of art, but also to the overwhelming passion and dedication of its fanbase. Sure, there are plenty of disagreements and debates over artistic interpretation and authorial intent, and we'll get to those in a second, but beneath all of that, there is just this undeniable, basically universal love and respect for this show. I mean, just look at how active the Breaking Bad subreddit is still to this day, or the fact that it remains the highest rated show ever on IMDb, with Ozymandias standing as the only television episode on the entire website to hold a perfect 10 out of 10 score. And then there's the fact that the memes are genuinely hilarious. Now, without knowing me personally, you won't fully grasp the magnitude of a comment like that, but the truth is that I often have a hard time connecting to the meme ecosystem / landscape of the various films and TV shows I'm into. But man, when it comes to Breaking Bad, it just hits my funny bone in the right way. I don't know why. If I ever want to have myself a good chuckle, I just go into the YouTube comment section of any Breaking Bad scene or video essay and it usually does the job. However, what does not make me chuckle in the slightest is the way people online often approach discussing Walter White and Breaking Bad, and by extension, art criticism as a whole. My main frustrations with Heisenberg discourse, if you will, really only boil down to two things. First of all, I find conversations about Walter White to be kind of shallow and simplistic at times, with people often speaking in rather black and white terms that honestly just do a disservice to the show's writing staff, who spent years crafting a morally complex character defined by his contradictions. And secondly, on a broader level, there's the way people, quite egoically in my opinion, discuss authorial intent. You know, the constant claims that others missed the point or are media illiterate, which again not only does a disservice to the writers of Breaking Bad, who have stated time and time again that there is no correct reading of the show, but also to the very nature of art criticism itself, which should, in my opinion, encourage discussion and interpretation and not be reduced to rigid gatekeeping. And yes, I'm fully aware that by titling this video the way I have, I'm kind of doing the exact same thing I'm criticizing here. But let's be honest, the YouTube algorithm rewards bold, absolute statements. It just is what it is. And hopefully, if not now, then by the end of the video, you'll realize that I really am making the case for a more nuanced way of discussing Breaking Bad and Walter White and art in general. So to really understand where all this discourse comes from, I think we first need to take a step back, watch about 500 Breaking Bad video essays, which I did before making this one, and try to gain a slightly better understanding of how Walter White White has been perceived over the years. You know, what the overall reaction to his character has been. Now, I was too young to watch Breaking Bad when it first aired, but even back then, I remember hearing people talk about it like it was the greatest thing on television, and more specifically, how Walter White was this absolute badass. Now, to be fair, this is a bit of an oversimplification. Obviously, not everyone saw it that way, and there were certainly viewers who recognized the darker aspects of Walter's character right from the beginning. However, it's undeniable that during this initial period, there was a pretty large portion of people who viewed Walter as an embodiment of power and defiance. A genius anti-hero who took control of his own destiny with force and intelligence. I distinctly remember seeing viral quotes such as, "I am the one who knocks," and "say my name," just plastered all across the internet, solidifying Heisenberg's status as a feared, respected, and inspiring figure in popular culture. Other prevailing sentiments of the time include the idea that Walter White was initially a good man, pushed by ego but also by circumstance and environment into making difficult choices, which all led to his eventual transformation into the ruthless and unstoppable Heisenberg, what we might call his Breaking Bad. Walter's relationship with Jesse was viewed as, sure, sometimes complicated and manipulative, but overall a surrogate father-son dynamic which was built on genuine care. And then of course there was the widespread hatred of Skylar White, who was often vilified by fans for holding Walter back, with some even going as far as to send death threats to actress Anna Gunn. Yep, that is a thing that people actually do. And look, while I would personally never tell someone how to think about something or that they are objectively wrong for reading art in a certain way, I think most of us can agree that this interpretation of Walter White and Breaking Bad as a whole is not only incredibly simplistic, but also relies heavily on cherry-picking certain moments, while ignoring the deeper, more troubling aspects of his character. For example, people who see Heisenberg this way will very rarely bring up the scene in Season 2, when he sexually assaults Skylar, or the countless times he displays his incredibly childish and pathetic ego, or the constant lying to himself about why he does what he does, or his reliance on being bailed out by others, usually Saul Goodman, and of course his manipulation which destroys the lives of all around him, not to mention the countless meth heads we never even get to see. And also, let's not pretend that while it's okay to find Skylar White kind of annoying, especially at the beginning, the biggest factor in people's hatred of her was just plain old childish misogyny. In fact, let's be real, this entire reading of Walter White seems pretty juvenile. Although, if you really think about it, it does kind of make sense. Considering the show's timeline and the stage the internet was at when Breaking Bad first aired, it's pretty obvious that this initial image of Walter was largely formed by younger web surfing viewers of the time, who didn't let the show's 18 rating stop them from watching good television, but who were therefore probably less inclined to pick up on the full spectrum of what the show was trying to say/accomplish. And while not everyone falls into this category, I have noticed a common trend with Breaking Bad fans who, only after watching the show for a second or third time years later, knowing what's to come and not being so swept up in the excitement, only then do they often realize Walter isn't the badass they once thought, but someone far more pathetic, insecure, and scared. And this all leads us to how Walter White is seen and spoken about on the internet nowadays, which is, in my opinion, a more truthful and nuanced interpretation of the character than the image that was so prevalent when the show first aired. These days, to browse the comment sections of the various Breaking Bad related subreddits is to read about a truly pathetic and manipulative man-child with an ego the size of Wisconsin. Walter White is now regarded as a prime example of toxic masculinity, a fragile, bitter man whose supposed rise to power was fueled purely by his own insecurities and selfishness. This shift in perception isn't just some random coincidence, it's the result of fans rewatching the show and, quite frankly, people maturing past that initial thrill of seeing a middle-aged dad throw on a black hat and threaten people. Nowadays, Walter isn't seen as the cool, confident mastermind some once thought him to be. Instead, he's acknowledged as someone who thinks he's that guy, but in reality is constantly stumbling, constantly failing, and constantly making things worse for himself and everyone around him. He's a man whose entire empire is built on a mix of ego, manipulation, and getting by with a little help from his friends. Scenes such as "I am the one who knocks" and "Say my name," which were originally viewed as badass displays of power, are now widely regarded as desperate, pathetic outbursts from a man trying to convince himself and everyone around him that he's in control. People now claim that Walter White did not break bad, did not transform into Heisenberg, despite what all the memes say, but that he was already broken. He was already Heisenberg deep down. His terminal lung cancer just an excuse to reveal the man he always was. We can see this in the way he turns down Elliot and Gretchen's money. It's pure pride, right? It's pure ego. Once he says no to the easiest, safest, and most logical solution to his problems, it becomes undeniable that this was never about securing a future for his family. It was about pride. It was about proving something to himself. Even Walter's relationships to other characters have done a complete 180. Or at least a 90 in the eyes of most fans. Take Jesse Pinkman, for example. No longer is this relationship seen as a complex but ultimately affectionate father-son dynamic. Instead, there's been a much deeper recognition of just how horrific Walt's treatment of Jesse truly was, manipulating him, gaslighting him, using his love and trauma against him, all while pretending to care. Jesse, once considered a funny, screw-up junkie, is now more broadly understood as the true tragic heart of the series, the victim of a man who never actually cared about him beyond how useful he was. Then there's the case of poor Skylar White. Over the years, the overwhelming hate against her has thankfully died down, and people have actually started to appreciate her role in the story. Where she was once seen as the nagging, disloyal wife who got in Walt's way, she's now more commonly understood as one of the most tragic figures in the show. A woman trying to hold her family together while being gaslit and manipulated by her increasingly dangerous husband. There is also this prevailing notion online that this interpretation is, in fact, the correct reading of the show. That Walter White was never an anti-hero, only ever a villain in disguise, and that if you rooted for him at any point, you simply didn't understand the story. Yes, haven't you heard? Any admiration or affection you have for Mr. White is you fundamentally misreading the show's true intentions. How embarrassing. Good old Heisenberg manipulated you just like he manipulated everyone else. You fell for the same lies the man told everyone around him, and himself. And if you think any differently, you just weren't paying attention. You're just not media literate enough to fully grasp Vince Gilligan's genius. Walter White was a terrible person from the beginning. End of story, end of video. Except I still actually think this is quite a simplistic way of looking at things. Now, don't get me wrong, this contemporary interpretation of Walter White is obviously a far more nuanced and, in my opinion, correct reading of the guy compared to, you know, Heisenberg is a Sigma male or whatever. But to be honest, I can't help but get the impression that this shift in perspective is kind of a backlash, a knee-jerk reaction, if you will, against that earlier interpretation of the character, and not the full picture. So while I totally get why people have shifted to this much more critical view, it still does just feel a little emotional, especially when you consider the amount of gatekeeping that often goes along with it. Seriously, if I had $1 for every time I saw someone online claiming that anyone who liked Walter completely missed the point of the show, I could have paid for the guy's cancer treatment myself, and we wouldn't be in this mess. It just feels like punching down, you know, like low-hanging fruit. Yes, congratulations, you've understood the show better than a bunch of 14-year-olds on the internet making Heisenberg Sigma edits, most of whom by this point in 2025 are clearly being ironic. But I personally don't think that merely recognizing the immaturity of these people makes you some bastion of intellect and media literacy who has the right to tell everyone else that their reading of the show is wrong. Especially when Vince Gilligan, the literal creator of Breaking Bad and Walter White, is clearly on that death of the author hype train. I refer to a question he answered back in 2013, where a member of the public asks him why Walter left the incriminating poetry book in his bathroom, to which Vince replied, "That's a fine question that even my 6 excellent writers and I tend to disagree upon. I think anyone who has an opinion on it has as valid an opinion as I do, and I'm not just passing the buck when I say that. This show is yours at this point just as much as it is ours, and you own it as much as we do." Well said, Vince. Bravo. So let's stop pretending that art is some puzzle to be solved. Like, that's such a boring way of looking at things, in my opinion. Honestly, the way some people talk about this show, you would think it's some sort of morality test. That if you're ever watching Breaking Bad and find yourself rooting for Walter White, find yourself cheering at any moments of his supposed badassery, Vince Gilligan's gonna leap out of your sofa and say, "Aha, you have fallen for my trap. You thought Walter was cool, but he's actually just a narcissistic, toxic chaotic mess, and so are you. Again, not saying everyone thinks this, of course not, but those who do are just, in my opinion, doing a huge disservice to the deeply nuanced writing of Vince Gilligan and the Breaking Bad writing staff. For me, personally, the genius of this show is perfectly captured in an observation I came across in a YouTube comment section of all places. It's from the scene where, after Walter runs over those two drug dealers, he meets Gus Fring in the desert, wearing his iconic black pork pie hat. And the top comment on this video reads, "I love how Walt wearing that hat rides the line between looking badass and like a complete dork." For me, whether they meant it or not, this summarizes pretty amazingly how I feel about Walter White, a phenomenon which I kind of just want to go ahead and call Schrodinger's Heisenberg, because this man is a walking contradiction. On the one hand, yes, he is a dreadful human being. He is selfish and manipulative, he uses people like pawns, and by the end of the show, has ruined the lives of countless individuals, including all those he once claimed to care about. He is, at his core, a dork, a loser, a man consumed by ego and delusion, willing to do basically anything to get what he wants, including poisoning children and working with neo-Nazis. I don't want anyone watching this video to think that I am, in any way, justifying this man's actions. He is a truly vile human being, and there's no getting around that. On the other hand, I think it is completely okay to indulge in Walter's ego-driven, disgusting rise to power, or fall from grace, however you want to look at it. There is an incredibly uncomfortable satisfaction to be found in Walter's journey, and in my opinion, it's a very natural and human reaction to, in some strange way, admire the guy, to root for him. You cannot deny that there is something truly thrilling about watching this man who once felt so powerless take control of his life with such intelligence and ruthlessness. It's not something we've seen on television, before or since. Yes, his actions are morally bankrupt, of course, but that doesn't mean we can't appreciate the sheer audacity of his transformation. I think there's something deeply human about his desire to prove himself, to take charge of his fate, and I don't think the fact that he goes about it in the completely wrong way negates any of this. And this is a slightly separate point, but I'm really not on the Walter was evil from the beginning hype train. The people who claim this more often than not point to Walt's rejection of Elliot and Gretchen's money as a sign that he was always Heisenberg. The pride, the ego, he was always going to break bad. But I don't know, man. I have pride, I have an ego, and I'm sorry to break it to you, but unless you're currently watching this video from some Buddhist monastery in the mountains where you've lived all your life, you probably have an ego as well. I think many of us in Walter's position would also have conflicting views about taking money from our now billionaire former partner and their spouse. However, most of us don't end up becoming psychopathic, child-poisoning drug lords, so again, I understand where people are coming from when they say stuff like this, but in my opinion, it kind of ignores the complexity of his transformation, which for me cannot and should not be untangled, I guess. The character of Walter White is supposed to be nuanced, supposed to be contradictory. The fact that people disagree on this stuff is a sign of good writing. For another example of Schrodinger's Heisenberg, let's look at a classic scene I've already mentioned, the infamous "I am the one who knocks" speech. Yes, on the one hand, as many people have touched upon, this is a demonstration of Walt's fear. Here is a man who's clearly scared for the safety of himself and his family, and who is trying to convince himself that he is some hardened criminal by yelling at his terrified wife who has just emasculated him. It's pathetic and sad and embarrassing. But the guy also has a point. I mean, he is the danger. He literally wins the drug lord chess match of death which the whole season has been leading up to. He kills and usurps the man who he is so scared of in this very scene. Again, I refer to an observation made in the YouTube comment section of this clip. Quote, "It's truly amazing how this scene is 100% serious, 100% tragic, and 100% hilarious all at the same time. Walter White is everything at once. He is an incredibly complex character, and I don't think we should be putting him in any kind of box. I mean, the show doesn't. Just look at how the direction fluctuates in portraying Walter throughout the 5 seasons, from the cinematography to the costumes to the music choices. We have scenes which are intentionally shocking, portraying the guy as the monster he is. We have scenes which blur the line, moments where we question his decisions but can't help but sympathize with him. And then there are the scenes where the direction seems to be on his side. I mean, just look at how the show ends, with Walter dying on the floor of a meth lab with a smile on his face while Badfinger plays. You can't honestly watch that final scene and claim that anyone who in any way indulges in the journey of Heisenberg is missing the point of the show. Remember, we are watching the show from the perspective of Walter, and that matters. It is not some intricate puzzle to untangle, but a piece of art to be experienced. The whole journey of Breaking Bad is supposed to make us feel uncomfortable. It is a show defined by its moral paradoxes. The final example I'll use is the scene in Season 5, Episode 11, when Walter needs Jesse to leave town, and ends up embracing the guy in this really complicated, ambiguous, awkward hug, which I believe to be simultaneously an act of genuine care, but also manipulation. But also care. But also manipulation. I mean, it just goes round and round in circles. I guess what I'm trying to say is that nothing in Breaking Bad is black and white. Its moral compass is, at its very nature, contradictory. The show makes no attempt to resolve that contradiction for us, and I don't think we, as viewers, should either. Although Walter should have absolutely gone go-karting with Jesse, and anyone who disagrees with me is a media illiterate moron who doesn't understand the show. Bravo, Vince!